What's poppin' everyone, trueeevil here, and today I'm bringing you my ultimate Lian guide, which is going to cover her progression from the very beginning of the game all the way to her final builds, as well as have multiple PvP builds for you to experiment. So without further ado, let's get in on it. Now, before we even talk about lattices, shells, modules, matrices, and all that, we need to just talk about why is Lian such an amazing burst unit, and that is because of two important factors. The first one I'm going to talk about is her passive, which is sort of hidden within her skill 1, which is Ninefold Flame. Basically, for every buff she has up to 5, she gets a total damage increase, and at the start of the game it's going to be 4.5%, and most people aren't going to fully upgrade her skill 1 for that 6%, but if you're a Giga Whale, that 30% damage increase at the end is super nice, but for most of us, 22.5%, which is still no joke. This is going to be amazing at all aspects of the game, especially in the end game once you have that final build. And it's really going to set her apart with some of the other burst units, with having her have some of the highest damage potential within the first 2 turns. And the other big reason why Lian is so amazing is because of her skill 3, which has a 30% turn meter steal at once it's finally maxed out, which if you use her at the very beginning of the game, it might seem minuscule, but once you bump it up to the 30%, that's not just a 10% increase, right? If it's hitting 4 people with that 80% chance, which is very high, it means that you're getting over a 100% turn meter steal and making it so Lian actually goes immediately after and can use her skill 2 immediately after the skill 3, which deals insane burst damage, and if you're using this in PvP, can pretty much clear 1 or 2 units guarantee. Now that we finally talked about why she's amazing, let's talk about her shell progression, because this is pretty important and is going to determine her matrices. Now, her very first shell that she can utilize pretty well is the Agent Lizard. Now, this is only for the beginning of your first day of the account, and you're going to switch to a different shell, but it's worth noting that this shell is pretty strong, and I level it up to level 10 because it gives you that huge damage spike at the beginning, and it allows you to increase the damage taken by 15%, and because of how it is clocked, it's going to follow your skill 2. Now, for her first real shell, she has 2 choices. The first one is going to be Doji, which means for 2 turns she's going to get a flat attack buff. And this is good because the buff counts as part of her passive, so not only is this giving her a flat attack, it's also giving her a total damage within it, and it lasts for 2 turns. And the important part of the 2 turns is when you use the skill 3 and you're able to immediately follow up with the skill 2, not only does the first attack get the damage upgrade, but also the skill 2 does as well, which means this shell, if the game is only going to last for a couple of turns, has an incredibly high damage output for her, compared to a shell that scales the longer the match goes. If you need a shell that scales later into the game, Budo Panda is her first shell that scales pretty well into that, because on the follow-up attack, if it does a critical hit, it makes it so she does a total amount of critical damage, and it stays as a buff. Now, I do think Doji is better than this at the beginning of the game, because on those first couple of days, you're not really fighting any boss fights that are going to last for 10 minutes. Generally, all the content is going to be a 2-minute fight, so I do recommend Doji. And on both of these, the best matrices are going to be that 12 Onslaught plus 4 Harvest. And Harvest is the one you want for the secondary, not because of the actual ability, but because it gives you that 10% attack increase. So you're going to get a total of 55% attack. So for Lian's epic shells, I actually recommend to skip them outright and go straight to Mythic, but if you do want to build an epic shell for Lian, here are her 2 best ones, starting with Twilight Knight. Now, the reason why Twilight Knight is so amazing on Lian is because although it does not proc on the very first turn, it's going to proc on her second turn, which means for Lian, she uses her skill 3, and then the following turn it procs and she's able to use her skill 2 on the enemy that gets the defense reduction and most likely knock them out. Now, this is especially amazing on Lian because of the turn meter steal on her skill 3, which means her next turn might possibly come immediately after, which happens quite a bit. So you're able to use her giant cleave, then her turn starts again, uses the Twilight Knight on their weakest enemy to give them that 50% defense reduction, and then she lays down the noise with that skill 2, which is going to knock out a bunch of little pretty boys. So definitely a great shell for her. Now, her other great epic shell, which is actually my personal recommendation if you're going to build one for Lian, is Crossroads. Now, the reason why Crossroads is so amazing on her is because Lian's best secondary matrix slot for the 8 is Fury. And Fury isn't a really good generic DPS to just switch around, and since shells cost so much, it's really nice to have a shell dedicated to Lian until you're able to get her final shells. So because of that, getting this with Onslaught 12 and Fury 8 is really nice to have, but not only that, but because it gives a flat attack buff and a life leech buff, that means you're getting that 9% total damage increase when this procs, which means she's absolutely going to lay down some noise, and because it lasts for 2 turns on the attack buff, it's going to make her skill 3 and skill 2 deal absolutely amazing damage. Now, it doesn't scale well the later the fights are, but you know, we're here for a good time, not a long time. Now, for the Mythic category, which is when people are starting to build their in-game shells, the first one I'm going to talk about is White Fang, which is her first shell she can get as a late game shell. Now, the problem with White Fang with Lian is that, well, she wants Fury for her 8 cost matrix, and because of that, White Fang is just an amazing generic DPS for a lot of units, and you want to switch this one around with your DPSs for the team comps you need. Unfortunately, if you go the Fury route for Lian, it's not going to be the best. So because of that, I do not really recommend building it for her unless if it's going to be the one that's just going to stay on her. And the best matrices for this are going to be 12 Keen Eye, 8 Fury, and later on Swift Raid. Now, you can do some variations on this. You can do momentum, but the problem with momentum is that it scales with debuffs, and Lian's passive wants buffs. So if you are going to put momentum on it, you're going to have a specific team that is going to still be able to do a ton of buffing as well as giving those debuffs. But this one also is a good scaler because the more you crit, the more crit damage you do, and this buff is pretty permanent, so really good scaling buff and is good in fights that last for more than 10 minutes. Now, the next best shell for Lian is actually a PvP specific shell, which is Law of Silence. Now, the reason why this shell is so powerful on Lian is it begins the fight with her in Void Stage, which, if you don't know what that means, she takes significantly less damage from AoE attacks, she can't be targeted, and she gets a ton of effect res, basically meaning that it takes away her main weakness, which is she is a squishy DPS. And due to that, the fight is going to happen all the first wave shenanigans, and because she is much slower than she usually is, because she can actually use Fury Edge and not have to worry about dying because she doesn't have enough speed, she can absolutely lay down some noise. Now, the problem with this shell is she's going to do a little bit less damage than she normally would, but I mean, you know, it's better for her to do her cleave and absolutely wreck than get CC'd into oblivion and never get a turn to begin with. So that's why this shell is really strong. I definitely recommend it, but it does take some of those extra resources, so I wouldn't focus on this shell in the first week because you're really building your PvE, and then you can go into these hyper-specific PvP shells. Now, the last shell I want to talk about is my personal recommendation for Lian for her final shell, which is Count. Now, Count is amazing on Lian for multiple reasons, and the first one is because it gives you that 2-turn attack buff and life leech buff. It basically means that Lian has permanent life steal on her attacks, but she also gets her 2 buffs off her unique passive that means she gets a 9% total damage increase to 12% total damage increase, and you don't have to rely on your teammates for that, which is important because sometimes in PvP, things happen. So this guarantees a lot of her unique passive, and it makes it so her skill 3 and skill 2 have an increased damage potential, which is really going to make her an absolute monster with burst potential. Not only that, but because this can be run as a generic DPS shell with 12 Kenai, 8 Fury, and 6 Swift Raid, it can also have a surprise factor with it, which makes it really strong in PvP actually. And that is because it is the only DPS shell that can utilize Bulwark, which gives you that immunity at the beginning of the fight, which can really throw people off because if you have Law of Silence, they know they need to play around Void because you can see that during the draft. With Count, they have to just lucky guess that you have Bulwark from either playing you before or other ways of seeing it. So with this surprise factor, you can get some easy dubs in PvP, and as well as it just has that flexibility that some of the other shells have. Now, the con of this shell is if the fight lasts for longer than 5 minutes, it's not going to scale the damage as strong as, say, White Fang, which gives you that continuous crit damage up. But, when I'm using Lian, I'm there for a good time, not a long time. I want to banish them into the Shadow Realm for 2 minutes or less are your money back guarantee. That's how I like to play Lian, so that is why I think this is the best shell for her. Now, let's talk about Lattice investment, because this is really important for everyone, because Lattices are the hardest to come by material in this game. And the most important thing to level up with Lian if you're going to use her is you need to max out her skill 3, and that is because of the turn meter steal upgrade. Now, if you look at it, it might seem a little low for going from 20 to 30%, but since this is an AoE cleave, it's not actually a 10% increase, it's usually like a 30 to 40% increase, which is absolutely broken on her and makes it so that she basically goes straight from the skill 3 into the skill 2. So if you build Lian, I think it's a requirement to max out her skill 3. Now, if you want to keep improving her, I think it's totally fine to just upgrade the skill 3 and that's it with her. But if you want a little more, because the skill 3 goes straight into the skill 2, if you make the skill 2 stronger, then it makes the skill 3 stronger, right? So I would recommend leveling her skill 2 all the way up to 3 to give it that additional attack, which is going to be a huge, significant damage upgrade. Now, you can upgrade it to 4 if you want a little bit more girth on that skill 2, but I would never recommend level 5 to anyone, even if you're a Giga Whale. Leave it at 4 at the max, and that is because you're always using Lian's skill 3, and having the cooldown 1 less on the skill 2, basically what that does is you use the skill 3, you use the skill 2, and then they both get off cooldown at the same time, which is a little weird. Now, the only couple of ways I would see you would want to use the skill 2 instead of the skill 3 is because, there's one enemy left and you're able to burst them down with the skill 2. But even then, a lot of the times the turn meter steal is usually more important than that and comes up much more often. So I just don't think it's worth that extra yellow lattice. Now, the one thing I would say is I really don't recommend using any on her skill 1. Now, her level 5 does make it so her passive does a lot more. This is like a 7.5% total damage increase, but I don't think that's worth 4 golden lattices, in my opinion. You're really using her to burst everything down with the skill 3 into the skill 2 and not really worrying about the skill 1. So because of that, I would say minimum investment with her, max skill 3. If you want to make her really, really strong and you're going to use her a lot, upgrade that skill 2 to either 3 or 4 and avoid skill 1 unless if you're a Giga Whale, and then skill 2, never level it past 4. Now that we've talked about all of Lian's upgrades from the beginning of the game to the end game, as well as how to upgrade her with lattices, let's just talk about units that work amazingly well with Lian. The first ones I want to talk about are just generic double buff units like Bayantin, Tsukio Mi. Her unique passive is amazing, so you want to just absolutely amplify it to be maximum before she even does that first turn, so that skill 3 and skill 2 really pop off. And Bayanton in particular is great because she gives that crit damage buff, which is very hard to get. Another unit that works really well with her is Valerian, which even though it doesn't look like she gives 2 buffs, what happens is because of Valerian's Hazy Dream, Lian will do her skill 3, immediately go into skill 2, and because it's 2 different turns, she gets 2 random basic buffs, which usually is enough to completely fill out all 5 buffs she needs for maximum damage by the time she goes to the skill 2. So any way you can get double buffs is a great unit to use with her, as well as having that crit rate up unit like Rosa or Gray is really going to help make her maximize her damage potential. And you can also use another type of unit like Rahu to give the defense up and have a little bit more protection versus the crit rate route. So those are my recommendations on units to use with her. She also scales, of course, with like Dina, but I do suggest to really think about getting her buffs before the debuffs. That's my opinion because I've seen some people complain about her damage output, and then you look at their team, and then everyone on their team is a debuffer, so she's not getting her unique passive. So that's everything I wanted to talk about in this guide. Please let me know in the comments if this was helpful, but also let me know how I can improve for next time. Since this is my first guide for a character in Etheria Restart, I want to keep improving them to the best of my ability, so please let me know what you would like to see differently for next time. But that's all for now. Hope you had a great first day of the game, and I'll see you tomorrow.